find yourself a booth, order up a cold one. This is the Spring Bar.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Spring Bar. Glad to have you here. I am Florida Mike, and today we have a very special guest. Joe and I are very pleased to welcome Carl Rosen with us today. For those of you who don't know, Carl Rosen is the current Bulova brand historian. He had a 30-year stint with the company prior to doing what he does now, so he brings a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, a lot of answered questions this episode. If you are one who's into history and brand history and things like that, and if you're a follower of our many Bulova series episodes, this one is going to be a treat. So, Carl, Joe, gentlemen, how are you guys doing this evening?
Great. And actually the first, last, and only Bulova historian that's ever
so far. Give it some. Mike's gearing up for that when he retires from his gator wrangling business.
Am I?
Who knows?
This is news to me. Well, okay, we'll go with it.
Yeah, to be fair.
We'll get into risks and drinks in just a minute. I do want to point out that I will not be around for the entirety of the episode. We are recording later in the evening on a Sunday. I do get up at 3 a.m. for work, so
it's going to be past Mike's bedtime.
Yeah.
So
in the event that I have to duck out, you will have the company of Joe and Carl. You don't need me here anyways. I'm sure that Joe will do a fine job of taking it home. Or maybe not. We'll see. I might have to edit myself
need
in.
To pour some more.
Yeah, I might have to edit myself in later.
Fair enough.
I can try to talk fast, Mike, if you want.
No. We don't want to keep you from giving any information. We want to hear everything that you have to say. In addition to that, usually I would say some stuff at the end of the episode. I'm going to do some housekeeping right now. On the Bulova YouTube channel, several years ago, probably about 4 years ago now, Bulova did a collector's series of videos. Carl, I believe you were the second video in that series. So in the event that there's stuff that we just don't cover, you do talk about other things in that video. So if you guys are listening and watching, you want to go check that out. It's the Bulova YouTube page. Go to their playlist. It's the Bulova Collector Series videos. I think there's maybe 10 or 12 videos, various people from within the company and some journalists and other people that have insight into what's going on. Very cool series to check out. So go take a look at that. You can watch Carl over there too.
I was going to say, never-ending story. So
it is.
You can find things there, but there's always things to discover.
Always things to discover.
Yes. We'll touch on that.
Carl is here. We are going to kind of do a three-part series. Leading up to some big Caravelle information that we've all hinted at that we get to discuss in June. So we've got Carl with us now. We're going to be kind of covering some what we call the Bulova lost years, some of the weird history of Bulova from the 80s and 90s. Then we're going to have Michael and the design team back on. We're going to talk about kind of where they're at in designs right now and some Caravelle design and things. And then the episode in June, hopefully we're still slated for that, is going to be a real big announcement. So I know we've been talking about that. We've kind of been hinting at it. That is one that you're not going to want to miss. So with all that out of the way, what are we wearing? What are we drinking? Carl, you are our guest of honor. What do you got on the wrist, if anything, and what do you got in the glass?
Well, on my left wrist, I've got a Space View, 214 caliber. I just thought it would be appropriate to have some iconic piece here. That's
okay. What year and which version?
It's
hold it up.
I think it's a 19. Well, I'll take it off here.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
Yes.
There you go.
It's sort of a squarish sort of shape, sort of with a dish chapter ring. It's in great condition. Actually, I bought it at a fair prior to Basel World, like 2018 or so.
So it's not the integrated bracelet, but it's like a T, and it looks like it has a Swiss chapter ring.
Right. Exactly. So anyway, it's in great condition, and I just feel with a lot of the iconic pieces or some of the reissues, it's like wearing a piece of history on your wrist. So I thought it'd be good, and I love the fact that a space view you can sort of see how it works, and it's always a conversation piece. So people say, what are you wearing? Why are you wearing that? And how does it work?
Exactly. Yeah. Very cool.
And on the other wrist?
On the other wrist here, let me take off. I've got.
We got two.
Double wrister. Double wrister.
Two. I'm so happy.
I actually gave a talk the other day to a men's group, and at the end, somebody sort of jokingly say, are you wearing a Bulova? And I said, on which wrist? Because I had an Accutron on one, on the other. But actually, I like this watch, which is actually very small in size. It's called a Sea Cloud. I
am not familiar with that watch. I don't think.
It's a very sort of sophisticated look. It's 1965 also. It's well, I see it on my wrist here. I'll do it this way backwards. Well, you can't see it too well, but it's fairly small. I don't know if it's almost like 30 millimeters, something like that. But it's got a very interesting case shape. It's faceted in the corners, if you can see it, and it's 14 karat gold.
Oh, good Lord.
Mechanical.
All right. So I'm popping up onto the My Bulova site so I can see if I can get a close-up image of that. Okay. And it's yellow gold or white gold?
Yellow gold. Called Sea Cloud.
Yellow.
23 joules.
Yep.
Small seconds.
Yep.
Wow. All right.
So
you got it there.
I got
it. Not only because I like it aesthetically, but it people go, gee, I've never seen that before. So I like
what year was it that you said?
65.
65.
So
okay.
Nice. An M5 on the case back is the code for 1965.
Which was they started doing that in the middle of the 60s and started the
L was the first. It
was the first, but like you don't see a lot of L1s or L2s often because sometimes they're going with the old date code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joe, I have an L0. I have an L0.
I know, and there's some that are out there, but they're harder to find because it wasn't as consistent going through with.
Do you remember? Do you remember my Academy Award ZZ?
Yeah.
That's an L0. It's 1950.
No kidding.
Yeah. Which I actually have to send back and get repaired.
Oh.
And that was only for like 3 years. It started in 50 to 53 with the Academy Awards. But sometimes you'll have date codes. Let's say it was really manufactured in 49, but it might have been sold in 50 or 51.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes
and I've noticed that a lot. Like when researching in the line books, I have to go to the book later than what the actual watch is stamped to find.
Sometimes, and then also you've got the watches that were made in 1 year but sold for multiple years, like the Oceanographer V, which is a 71 date code, but it's in the line book for 3 years. So, see, you got the right guy. We can talk about all this stuff. We can get into minutia. This is so good. I'm so happy.
Joe, you're next.
Okay. Oh. Okay, I have got on the Hoyer, the Bulova Hoyer, the 1163, the caliber 15, asymmetric case, left-hand drive, and this was my holy grail watch. So I thought that with our discussion today with Carl, that would be the one to wear.
Yeah, there are some holy grails. You also have the original Marine Star, which is I think around the same time frame.
We're going to get into that one. We're talking about that one because it's time. It's time to talk about that sucker. Mike, what do you got?
Yeah. What do you got in the glass, Joe? What are you drinking?
I'm drinking Canadian whiskey because the tariffs haven't kicked in yet. So
right, well,
fair enough.
I got my Macallan here.
Oh, that's right. We got to talking about date codes and we forgot to ask what he was drinking. We made him pour a glass and then we forgot to ask him.
And forgot to. It's okay. He's enjoying it regardless.
Well, actually, my date codes, it could be 12, it could be 18. It could
be...
what do you got,
I'll bring
Mike?
up the rear. I am wearing my I pulled up on the screen here. 1972 Jetstar D. This is the lesser known version, slightly different case than the 1973. This has got the protruding crown and the rare red and white handset. Um, this is kind of the OG Jetstar for me. This is really the one that started it all.
Yeah. What I like about that is sort of the shape in the shape, where you've got
Right.
the in sort of a oval shape. There were some Jetstars back then. The case shape itself was about there.
Yeah.
So that's such an interesting line, and it was nice that they did the relaunch of that with the precisionist movements, because you got to see this sort of this continuation. But if you get the chance to go to a Monday meeting, Mike has a reinterpretation of that particular watch that should not be too difficult to produce, and just putting a plug in.
Sometimes what we do is we don't necessarily reproduce it, but we inspire things. So sometimes we'll update to make it a little bit more contemporary, maybe the case shape. But I remember in the Jetstar in particular, I looked in the archive and worked with the production people and took the exact dials that we had. So the Jetstar came out in the sort of I consider it like a Merlot kind of color dial.
Mm-hmm.
There's one that's like butterscotch with a degraded finish on the dial. So those were the inspirations. There's also one with like red and blue markers. And
the Stars and Stripes-esque one.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mike is, and he will be the first to admit, he is the world's leading expert on all things Jetstar, with the only, well, at the time, the only complete collection of all vintage Jetstars that had been recorded or advertised.
Well, my tears are going to fall into my glass of Redbreast Irish whiskey. This is whiskey number 2 in my journey of whiskeys that I have. Remember, what was it? Last episode we talked about, I got 4 different samples to try.
Mm-hmm.
So,
correct.
I'm drinking it just on the rocks, a little bit of water, and it's not bad. Like you said, Joe, this one's a little mellow, a little smooth. It goes down pretty
Redbreast
nice.
is nice. Redbreast is really nice. It's a good bottle. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to jump right into it, we are talking with Carl. So, Carl, what was your position at Bulova before you became historian, before you became emeritus?
Well, I started in 2010. I started in 1980 and I retired in 2010. So I held a lot of different positions. At the end, I was the chief operating officer. So I had responsibilities over customer service, IT, the repair department. When I retired, I think we had a repair department of 62 people. I had procurement, so there was a lot of different functional areas. But the other thing, I was the president of Bulova Swiss SA, which was based in Fribourg, Switzerland. So I was responsible for all the international distribution at the time. So that was fun to get involved with the different cultures and different people around the world, and travel and see Bulova from other people's perspectives too. It was.
Did you have your hand in AccuSwiss, or was that after you?
No, I was there.
Okay.
And AccuSwiss, actually, we had a great advertising campaign in 1983. I think Great Faces with Accutron Swiss. Is it AccuSwiss or There's Accutron Swiss also.
Because Accutron Swiss would have predated it. AccuSwiss was the Accutron rebranding with anything that was the Swiss movements. And so it was a really strange thing. I have a couple of watches that are, depending on which year you bought it, it was going to be either a Bulova or it was going to be an AccuSwiss. And it's a very interesting time period then they scrapped that branding completely and kept the same watches, kept the line.
Originally Accutron was a technology. It became a sub-brand, and then it became a brand on its own. And then we wanted to preserve that legacy. And it was great in 2020 that we were able to relaunch a totally new technology with the electrostatic movement.
Yeah.
And it's really become a standalone brand again.
It has, and we've had Richard on a couple of times to speak to that specifically. Yeah. And he's so much fun to have talking about the brand, like such a passion for the brand.
But he's so enthusiastic about it too. Like
he is. Okay, so hang on. What did you sell to him recently?
I sold him my all original 1970 Bulova Braille, the first iteration, the first generation of the two.
High torque hand wind movement and that pop up dial, so you can feel the
right.
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of selling, Richard was very critical before he joined Bulova. He was a collector. And because of him, I was able to start the archive. I bought from him
Mm-hmm.
160 watches to get the archive kicked off. So I flew down actually to see him in Richmond, Virginia. And he showed me what he had. And he said, I'm only going to consider these to sell these to you because these watches are coming home.
There.
So, coming home.
Isn't that lovely, though?
Yeah. So it was, and it's become a great relationship since then. He and a lot of other collectors have been extremely critical uh, to me as the historian about, they're much more experts on specific watches and technology, and I've tried to utilize them and engage the collector community as much as possible.
Well, Mike and I have benefited from that specifically, just because there's been people that have reached out to us about specific models, specific brands. Mike has been into the Jetstar line. I collect 666s specifically. So, there's people that'll reach out like, oh, so and so said, like, okay, well, I might be able to help you. But it's been a fascinating watching this relationship develop, and then watching Bulova lean into its history, because a lot of the history is hidden, for lack of a better term. It's not well known, it's not well documented, and it becomes harder to find. So if we're going to get into it, Bulova was founded by Joseph Bulova, went through the family, and the family was involved with it, and then things happened. And it's currently owned by the Citizen Corporation. But before it got to Citizen, it went through a couple of different hands. So could you talk us through that just a little bit? Like, when did we lose control from the Bulova family and then move into other corporate owners?
Okay, so the family started in 1875, Joseph Bulova. And he was, the guy until he died in 1935. And then his son Artie took over. And he was head of the company until he died in 1958. And his nephew, Harry B. Henschel, who was the grandson of Joseph Bulova, took over as president of the company. Actually, at that point, I think it was Omar Bradley, the last five-star general of the United States, that became chairman of the board. So that was 1958. But come the early 1970s, an old name conglomerate named Gulf and Western bought something like 30% of Bulova. And it was really as an investment. I don't think they did try to actively manage it whatsoever. So that was until maybe 1976, when a company called Stellux, Stelux, which is a watch manufacturer. They did a lot of bracelets. They were a watch distributor, bought the shares from Gulf and Western.
They were out of Hong Kong, correct?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that lasted until 1979, when Loews Corporation, that's Loews, the also a conglomerate, but they had the Loews Hotels, Lorillard Tobacco, CNA Insurance, a lot of different items. They were a $14 billion a year company, that they became the White Knight and bought the shares from the family and from Stellux. I started in 1980. They asked me to join because they bit off, quite a bit, and they needed to deal with the acquisition of Bulova, and particularly because of the Stellux merchandise. So one thing I respect Bulova for is we decided that the quality of the merchandise that was out in the marketplace was not Bulova quality. It was a Hong Kong merchandiser. And we felt that we really need to get the product off the streets. So we actually instituted what we call a 3-to-1 buyback. So if you bought one watch, a retailer, we would take back 3, just so that we get it out of the marketplace. So we didn't want to get those watches on people's wrists. So we had a big turnaround undertaking for that. And then when Loews decided that they wanted to vacate the business, which was small compared to their other businesses, we wanted to make sure that there was a strategic partner that we worked with. We wanted the brand to succeed. We wanted to be long-term, and it was really a great marriage with Citizen, which was a big supplier. If I may, I'll go back to the original Citizen relationship, because that was not the first.
Please, because so we know that Bulova had purchased Miota Movements, which is a Citizen brand.
Right.
So Citizen has been a part of the Bulova brand for a long time, including the Hysonics, where it's licensed Accutron, but in a Citizen case and with a Citizen dial.
But it was even before that. In
Okay.
1960, I think was the first relationship they had with Citizen. And
Yeah, right. They were showing up in caravels.
Yeah.
yeah, so they had a deal where Citizen was going to make dual lever movements, and at the same time, as part of the same agreement, they became the marketer and distributor in a lot of different markets, including Japan, for Bulova.
So the Asian market, essentially.
Yes, or where Citizen had distribution.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to that because there's a question about some stuff, and we'll get into. That's really fascinating though, because so they're using buying Citizen product, but then they're using Citizen's marketing in order to get better distribution worldwide.
Right.
That's great.
And then they also did a joint venture in about 1970 in a town called Fuji Yoshida factory. It was 49% owned by Citizen and 51% owned by Bulova. It's a factory that was about 60 miles outside of Tokyo. So there were, products manufactured there. The factory was the first that was allowed outside of Switzerland to make Accutron movements. You talk about the Hesonic, which is really a 218 movement,
Right.
not the 214. So they've had a relationship for many, many years. And when I was there, I had procurement. So I would have to buy components. In the 1980s, Bulova decided to get out of the manufacturing business. We closed our factory in Switzerland. We closed the factory in Providence, Rhode Island. And we decided that we needed to have the flexibility to buy from the best factories, both movements and cases and bracelets, dials, whatever.
Was that decision though? Was that decision gone? What? Okay. Was that a financial decision or was that a mechanical decision? Were other countries and other manufacturers ramping up past what Bulova could do, or were they just able to do it cheaper?
We didn't have the critical mass to continue to invest from an R&D standpoint. Movement was technology was moving quickly. You had quartz movements. You had to have come out with different calibers, different complications, different sizes, and we just didn't have the volume that we could justify manufacturing for just ourselves. So we decided. Actually, the plant at one time was 900 people in BN, Switzerland, making movements for Bulova. So we decided rather than control all those parts, I was in charge of called the material requirements planning, where I would order dials and hands and cases and bracelets and movements, schedule the factories. But then you wind up with a mismatch of components. So, sometimes something would fall out. You'd have more cases than you'd have movements. You'd have to try to figure out what to do with it. It just made a lot of sense to start to source on a worldwide basis and not just from one supplier. Actually, forgot one thing about Citizen. In the 1970s, Bulova made digital watches.
Yes. The LEDs, right? The Computrons and that whole line. And so you've got the driver's style, and you have your regular kind of more a regular face with a stand-up dial.
And actually, there's one very interesting thing, one called the Phantom, that was like the world's thinnest digital LED watch that just had two buttons on the top. Anyway, you should Google it and take a look at the Bulova Phantom. But at the time, chips were very hard to get. Bulova was sourcing from Texas Instruments. There was another supplier. So actually, they used Citizen as a third supplier so that they could manufacture the Computron. So technologically, Citizen was a real partner for many, many years in a lot of different capacities. So it made a lot of sense. I think about 85% of the watches at the time of the acquisition contained Citizen movements. And there were other manufacturers. We also had Swiss watches, but it really was a great marriage for them as well as Bulova to continue on with a legacy. And now we're at 150 years and counting.
It's something else. And knowing that the relationship has been going on for that amount of time, and that's without even getting into just the quality of the Miyota movements and the access that Bulova has as a partner and as a manufacturing partner and as a subsidiary of what they're able to gain. You're looking at the new GMT movements, looking at some of the other options that have just come out within the last 5 years. It's a really interesting relationship, and I wasn't aware that it went back to 1960 for that amount of time, because we knew that the Caravel line starts in 62 and that they featured a lot of Miyota movements, but also a lot of the Caravel movements were Swiss, which is not something that people really think about, because the discussion that we have had has always been about the fact that Caravel was the drugstore brand, and at one point was the highest selling mechanical jeweled movement, which was a slight dig at Timex, who is also currently using Miyota movements. So it's a really interesting.
I don't think it was a slight dig, but
yeah.
There's a very funny commercial that I have in the archives from that era, where a couple goes into a drugstore or to a jeweler, and the person wants their watch repaired, and the jeweler takes it and says, well, "Why don't you bring that back to your drugstore?" So it was talking about not only quality but the distribution and the support that you had for Caravel. It was an entry level fine jewelry piece.
Yes.
Wasn't there also a print advertising that had them side by side, and it said, ask your jeweler which one they'd rather work on, kind of.
Right. And Bulova used the word druggist, I think, which there was some negative feedback from the pharmacy trade class, but anyway, I think it worked in the consumer's mind.
But what's interesting, going back into the 60s, is the first ever really display caseback was the Caravel Companion, and that was highlighting a Miyota 7-jewel 11 DP movement. So that was
unfinished, nothing to it.
But at the time it was fantastic. It was beautiful. It was revolutionary. It was the whole nine. And they chose the Miyota movement to highlight, to the public, to be able to look into the case back and see all the mechanical workings. And so a cool tie in there.
It's a look. So I've got that watch. Mike's had one. Do you still have yours? Or are you?
Nope, I still have it. Yep.
We both love that watch, and particularly is the fact that it's a factory case back. Because when I first saw it, I assumed that it was an aftermarket mod that someone had done. It's like, oh no, that's a factory. I'm like, for a Miyota 7 jeweled movement, that's what we're showing. We're showing that off.
To go one step further, just a little tidbit for our viewers and listeners. The Companion came in 2 versions. There was the see-through caseback version and a solid caseback. The solid caseback is actually marked waterproof on the dial, and the display caseback does not have that marking on the dial for obvious reasons. You would not want to get that one wet, I'm sure.
some cracks in the finish, perhaps.
Yeah.
I have a story sort of about that exhibition type situation outside of Caravel, though, which I think would be interesting. But I showed you my watch here, the 14 Space View. So I don't know if everybody realizes, Bulova had no intention of having a Space View when they launched Accutron.
Never.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When they showed the jewelers using like a prototype or demonstration model what the watch looked like, sometimes with a cutout dial, the jewelers were the ones that said to Bulova, "Wow, why don't you show that to the consumers?" And that's how the Space View was born. So Space View models didn't start until 1961, even though it was October 1st, 1960, when Accutron was launched. But when you fast forward, there's a great video on YouTube that you can find from the architect for the Pompidou Center. Are you guys familiar with this story?
No.
Okay. So
I've heard the story. Go ahead.
One of the architects, Richard Rogers, was given by his mother an Accutron Space View when he was a teenager. And that inspired him to showcase how things worked. And that's why the Pompidou Center is designed so that you can see all the inner mechanics and the workings of the building because of the Accutron Space View.
Huh.
So he did a 2.5 minute video showing the watch and talking about how this was his inspiration.
I've seen that.
Interesting.
And it's a fascinating story, just with that really interesting watch tie-in. And it's sort of strange. Like, this is where inspiration is going to strike, and here's where it's going to come from. And maybe it's just a thing that you're staring at on a daily basis.
Yeah. And so if you talk to Richard, he'll always tell you that there's a history and mystery to Bulova. Like, sometimes things will just sort of happen and you have to sort of figure out, well.
Yeah. You want to know where Richard got that saying from?
Oh, yeah?
He's sitting right there.
Really? Really? What actually I say is, my position as the historian is I'm half sleuth and half storyteller. So I've got to find the story and then communicate it and tell people about it.
Well, okay, then let's talk about a little bit of the history, because the be-all, end-all for Bulova are the line books. And the line books exist in a variety of different formats. There is a PDF version that's been floating around that a number of collectors have, that has, handwritten scribbles from the retailer that it had. And even that particular one is missing. And it only goes up to, what is it, like 78, 79? I think.
Thereabouts. Starts somewhere around 50s.
Mid 50s. Right.
Yeah.
And so, and it only goes up to there, and then it stops. So let's talk about the line book, because that is our historical record. But even with that, knowing that Bulova had specific lines that were available domestically in the US, and then they had the European lines, they had maybe some different Asian lines. There are watches that both Mike and I have that are not in the line book and that are well documented. And then there are watches that we have that are not in any line book and not documented, and no one knows. So can we talk about the line books just a little bit? I assume you have copies of the originals.
Yes, and there is 1 year that I don't have, that nobody has, that, if it ever services, we'll make it available. And I work closely with mybulova.com. So sometimes I will have some things and I will share it with Stephen Ullman. And, we're better off that collectors just have this information and can deal with it. And that's a great source of information, the whole collector community that they've developed. So I think 1979 is when it stopped, or 78, because that was when the company was sold to Lowe's. And Stellix stopped doing that. It was a great resource. It was the way the salesman would sell the watches, have a reference when they go into a store to take the physical orders. When I was there, we actually instituted, and maybe because maybe I was the one that recommended this, is it was a very static document that if styles came in or left, you now have to rephotograph and redistribute. So what we came up with was a mechanism where we would have, think of it as a picture book, like you would put in watches into different picture photos into different slots, a photo album. So we did that with watches. So each watch was individually shot, and we started doing it in color. And then we would send these things out with a sort of a leatherette bound cover. And it might be one for Bulova, one for Caravel, one for Accutron, whatever, and send it out to the guys. It was mostly male at the time, sales reps.
It still is.
And then what we would do is, we would send information. Here's a new watch. Take this one out because it's sold out. And so it became very modular and very flexible. But for the collectors now, it's sort of amorphous. You can't find what was there other than in, maybe in advertising. So it was sort of a two-edged sword from a collector's standpoint. It made it very flexible for the salesman. They only showed models that were available. It was color, the quality was much better, and you could update it as needed.
So if we're looking like the 1980s, 80s, 90s, what are going to be the notable models that we're really talking about? Because when you think about the 70s, you've got the divers. You've got variety. There's a ton of other things, including the discussion about Mike had the Academy Awards watch, which was a fantastic line. You've got a variety of the different presidents' watches. You've got then these labels that go with stuff. But what were the notable models that came out of the 80s and the 90s?
Okay, 80s, I guess most notable is probably Marine Star.
Right.
In the United States, Marine Star started about 1983, 1984. And I was there, and it was a great kickoff. Bulova had been known in the 70s for all those dive models. You talked about the Oceanographer, which became the Devil Diver, the 666 models that you guys collect. And there was a super compressor that was 1,000.
Right. The EPSA cases, right?
Yeah. So there were a lot of dive stuff. There was even the Sea King. I mean, there's a lot of things related to diving. So Marine Star was sort of a natural evolution, but the original Marine Star was circa 1970 in Europe. And I can talk about that story if you.
We'll get there. We'll get there because that's a reissue, and we want to touch on that in just a little bit.
So Marine Star became one of the first collections. It was almost like a sub-brand. And I used to go to Brazil, and the market there knew Bulova only because of Marine Star. The chronographs,
really?
Yeah, the chronographs were the item in Brazil, and you could hardly sell anything other than a Bulova Marine Star chronograph back in the 1980s. And it was also great because sometimes we would do duets. It was both male and female,
right?
And so it was great to be able to have watches for both sexes. So that was great. Bulova didn't do a lot of collections, I think, prior to that. You talked about the Academy Award. Yes, that was, to me, that was maybe the first collection. We had watches that transcended years, going back to, say, 1927 was the Lone Eagle, when
you had mentioned that before when we were talking offline. And so the Lone Eagle was a tribute watch to Lindbergh for the transatlantic flight. And then they kept reissuing it. What's the story with that?
They did this with the president's watches too. There was each year it would evolve. It would be a different model or a different couple of models, but I wouldn't say it was like a full collection. And it was called Lone Eagle because that was his nickname.
He was the Lone Eagle.
He flew solo. So there were a lot of watches, the Goddess of Time. There were many different versions of the Goddess of Time over years. But if you look even through, say, mybulova.com, you'll see in one year, and then the next year there's a different model. And then oftentimes it would be Model A, Model B, Model C. Actually, usually A wouldn't be the name because they didn't know they were going to do another one. When you did B, you knew it was the second one. So, the Chrono C, the Chrono D, there's
right.
a lot of different ones. But Marine Star, to me, is the first one I can remember as a real collection where you put the collection name on the dial too. Jets, I mean, there were some Jet Stars, but this was sort of in a major way. But
like you said, the big differentiator is having that stamped on the dial, because it really, up until that point, they really didn't have those names on them, even though they were referred to as a Golden Clipper J or Golden Clipper whatever, or Jetstar this and that. It wasn't part of the name. With the exception of the Oceanographers, those were stamped on there.
Well, the other one is the Astronaut on the
Yes.
And that, yeah.
Right.
In 1963, when L. Gordon Cooper went up in Mercury Space 7 wearing that Accutron watch, it was only after he flew into space with that watch that it was designated as the Astronaut. So from that time on, Astronaut was on the dial for that particular one. But that's a sort of unique situation.
It's a real quick marketing point too, though, because obviously.
Hold on. While we're on the topic of the Astronaut, because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but what was the Astronaut was actually on a shuttle mission. Do you know which one that was? was worn on a shuttle mission. One of the early ones, and I forget.
What are you talking about?
This is Stump the historian here. Okay.
Oh,
On a shuttle mission, I don't.
I'd have to look it up, but one of the astronauts wore it on one of the very first shuttle missions. So it was used all the way, as early as that.
Gus Grisham wore it.
right. Well, they were using that because it was a highly accurate watch, and it could withstand the testing conditions because you were at altitude or you had high temperature, and that was the reason that they were used in the SR-71s for those pilots, because it could withstand the cockpit conditions.
Right. So the cockpit conditions would be 140 degrees Fahrenheit,
right,
and you also had the G forces.
Right.
So one thing about the Accutron is it only had like 12 moving parts too, compared
phenomenal for the amount of accuracy that watch has, and the fact that there's nothing really going on other than the fact that you can't touch the index wheel with your fingers because you'll ruin it. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
I'll continue to
Mike's,
look at it.
Mike's going to look it up. He's going to look up what shuttle mission had the astronaut on it.
Dr. Norman,
if you say Challenger, it's going to be bad, dude.
Oh, well, that's the one that it was on. Challenger STS-7 in June 1983 is when a 3-line Bulova Accutron astronaut was worn on the shuttle Challenger STS-7, June 1983.
Okay, we do have records of the 46 different space missions that the Bulova participated in, not only in watches and clocks, but other precision instruments, altimeters, seismometers.
Isn't that something else? It always blows me away.
Gosh, and another cool piece of information on the astronaut, maybe about a year or so ago, on I believe it was one of the Facebook pages, the Accutron Facebook page, there were declassified CIA documents going through like all the equipment that was issued to the pilots, and on there was lists of serial numbers for the astronaut watches, and people went crazy checking the backs of their watches looking to see
is it mine? Is it mine?
An actual CIA issued astronaut.
Yeah.
So those are out there now too.
They are. What a fantastic story, though. There's all of the sled driver stuff that goes with that, and the fact that those watches have become this little bit of hidden history that like you have to know. You have to go through a couple different layers in order to get just to that specifically.
Then you also have the Lunar Pilot, which was reissued in 2016. So that's a whole
that story
episode on the Lunar Pilot.
I followed that story from its inception, where someone it was on a NASA forum had reached out to Dave Scott and was like, yeah, I heard that something happened to your Omega. And he's like, oh, yeah, something happened to Omega. I've got the watch is in a safe deposit box. I think it's a Waltham. And whatever. And so then he went and checked the safe deposit box. I was like, oh, no, it's a Bulova. And the internet went nuts and trying to figure out everything about it. And then, he put it up for auction and all of the things happened surrounding that. But still, I can remember seeing the first post, and it was from him specifically saying, yeah, I must have been a Waltham. I don't remember.
Yeah, no, Bulova tried to be the official watch, and we were not chosen.
No.
But we gave him a watch that turned out to be a savior.
The hero.
The hero watch.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to dive into this just a little bit. We're going off script here, but
now that I've thoroughly derailed us, you're welcome.
No, you have, but this is going to be good. This will be good. The story is that the Millships reissue, when that was being developed, that it was the preferred watch by the divers, and then they changed the spec. And the story is Omar Bradley ends with procurement and says it's only going to be 1,000 watches at most, and he decided to nix the program so that they could focus on Accutron, because this was 1958. Accutron had already been in development. They knew that it was coming. And does that hold credence for you? Does that float for you?
Yep.
Okay.
Because
Mhm.
you're talking about 1,000 watches. So from a commercial standpoint, it's very limited. It's very prestigious. We went through all this testing and approvals. We have the records of all the tests, but it was 1958, which is the highlight, the peak of the Accutron development. And if you had a choice between 1,000 watches or what ultimately became 4 million plus watches, it was obvious where you wanted to commit the resources for the corporation.
In such a spectacular change in neurology. I mean, we know it now as a no-brainer, but to have that foresight back then,
Yeah.
to be able
But,
to,
like,
invest your
looking
time
at
and
Omar
energy in the
Bradley,
Accutron project.
but Omar Bradley being the general that he was, but in the point being that you do not rise to that level of success without understanding everything that goes on underneath. And looking at it from a procurement standpoint, looking at it from a development standpoint, and being able to use his connections to be able to say, you know what, probably not the best idea for us financially, regardless of the prestige that it would give, because Accutron is going to get us so much more. That's such an interesting. The story about that is so fascinating, and I love trying to delve into that.
Another story about Omar Bradley. He was in 1945. He was head of the Veterans Administration when Bulova opened the Joseph Bulova School.
Yes.
And Harry Davis Henschel, who was the father of Harry B. Henschel, served with Omar Bradley in World War II. And I think that's how the relationship started. And actually in the archives in one of the museums I have the hat that was owned by Harry D. Henschel that he wore during World War II.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Because of a friend in the army. That's how you.
Also the story about the 5-star watches.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes.
So, we had the capacity to make our own dials and modify them and stuff. So, he would have 5 stars printed on his Accutron. And because he was the only person that could wear a 5-star.
Right.
He was the only 5-star general. So it was reported that 12 times in his lifetime, he gave away his watch to someone who impressed him, who he wanted to thank or acknowledge. So in the archives, we have several of those watches with the 5-star. And one of them is engraved with HS on the case back that I did the provenance that was given to Haile Selassie, the last emperor.
No way. Really?
Who was a real NASA freak. He loved space, and he would go to space launches, and I have a record of when he attended a space launch, I think, with Omar Bradley, which is when he was probably given that watch.
No kidding. Haile Selassie, the last sovereign emperor of Ethiopia. That's fantastic. I had never heard that story. I know collectors who have 5-star dials.
Oh.
And they talk about it, and they've had to trace down the provenance of it and to come up. But can you make a correlation between those 5-star dials and the Marine Star, the logo for Marine Star, which is a series of stars?
I know it's a series. I don't know if that was. I don't think that was the inspiration, because the Marine Star originally from 1970 or circa 1970, I think started in Europe anyway.
Okay.
And I think that he probably had less impact there. I think it was a nice logo. I don't know for sure. The first ones were red.
Yes.
Red circle stars. Maybe he saw that and he said, "Hey, I'm a 5-star general. I can do this, so I will."
So let's talk about the Super Seville, which has been recently reissued. There's the Complecto collaboration, and there's a variety of dials. But the Super Seville, if we're going to be honest, is a relatively derivative watch. The originals, they're very much like the Rolex Day Dates or Date Justs. So, and that seems to be a watch from the 80s. I mean, both Mike and I we both got the modern. Like Mike's got one of the first reissues. I have the Complecto collaboration, and then Mike, you've got the black dial.
And I have the black dial.
Green dial. I love the green dial.
The green dial is fantastic, without question. Like you've got the vintage, like the president day date. I have a silver dial day date, and then I have a blue Datejust. Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
That's the one I have too. Yep.
It's great. And it's so comfortable too. I just
Isn't
love
it?
Oh, it's a
But anyway,
fantastic
so
watch.
the origin, I think this was launched probably circa 1979 in Europe. I'm not sure it was launched initially in the United States. I think it was a ETA 2834 caliber, maybe.
Sounds about right.
What I think
Yeah.
was cool was that caliber had a full day at the 12 o'clock.
Yes.
Not just MON, but it's MONDAY.
Whole spell out. And I think you can also find those in other languages too, right? I think I've seen them, but I don't know if that's an aftermarket edition.
I wouldn't be surprised, especially if it were in Europe. And Bulova was extremely strong in Italy.
I was going to ask about the Italian market. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Italian market was the biggest market for Bulova. Probably still is from in Europe. I remember when I took over international and in the Italian market, there was like a 70% name recognition for Bulova.
No kidding.
Unaided. People just knew all about Bulova. But anyway, getting back to the Super Seville, it came in two different versions that I know of. A round, and then the same shape that we have, sort of a little like Nautilus-y type shape.
Yeah, that square-ish.
Yeah. But both came with that dial, the 2034 caliber with a full day. So today it's very hard to replicate that with a full day. So the new version has high precision quartz. It's calendar only, but it's just a great piece and pays a lot of homage back to that original. I think in this version in the square shape is probably circa 1984.
Well, we had Danelle on, and his whole point was like that was the watch that he had. Yeah,
TJ.
Excuse me, TJ. We had TJ on.
Both great guys.
who had a whole conversation about that. Like he had one of those, and it was sort of the impetus to make that reissue. And that's a watch that I have loved forever. I don't have a vintage version, and I know that there's a few different iterations of it, fluted bezel, smooth bezel, etc. So just the fact that became the reissue, and with the precisionist movement, which I think it's a fantastic fit. I love the Complecto dials. I love the stone dials. And I think that's going to be something that moving forward, it's something that the brand's going to be really able to use, because you're right. It is such a comfortable watch. It does wear well.
But what's really nice is doing with Complecto, you've got a sort of new, especially younger audience, and sort of going and taking something sort of vintage and a nod to the nostalgia, but you take it to a whole different level when you're putting these unusual dials like that blue dial or the tiger eye dial.
I've got the turquoise. I love it to death. And I saw that was going to come out. I'm like, that's it. I'm done. So I don't need to worry about anything else.
That, people will say, what's that on your wrist?
What is that? Yes, it is absolutely a competition starter. 100%.
The green dial, the green is a really nice, like an emerald green, a beautiful color. But it's a little bit more sophisticated and not sort of out there. But that blue dial is really pops.
It's something else.
Yeah. Yeah, the green I have personally, I actually did some service work on a blue dial version, so I got to see both of those. That blue is fantastic. I think the vertical brushing on that dial is really what lends to getting that deep color out of there versus having gone with a sunburst or something like that. But that vertical brush is fantastic.
Yeah, and one thing I have in the archive, I have actually a lot of old dial books where it's just a portfolio of dial after dial after dial. So we had it as a record for the service department of all of them.
Really?
So sometimes what I will do is with product development, we'll go back and look at the dial and the different finishes, whether or not it's degradé or particular colors. And, we'll look at PMS colors. What?
Is that digitized?
No.
Oh, man.
No. But sometimes with the digitization of something like that, you don't get the appreciation
Yeah, that's true.
of all of those. But so
Oh man.
I have this, I had the service department. So, we had to make sure we understood what the whole bill of material was so that this watch is made up of this case, this dial, this bracelet. Um, and we would even have Rolodexes, which have since automated, but where I would call it Gazinta. This case, Gazinta, this watch. All these different watches. And originally in the early part of the company, Joseph Bulova sort of was thought of as the Henry Ford of watchmaking, where he tried to standardize a lot of different components and sizes so that it would not only be easier to manufacture, but easier to repair. And so, anyway, so that was interesting. The other thing is naming conventions. We had a conversation the other day about this, but people don't know, and maybe I should share it with mybulova.com, but we started to run out of numbers. When you're in business since 1875, you can only make a certain number of 5-digit numbers when you start to run out. So in the 80s, I guess, we moved to a instead of a numeric number to an alphanumeric. So let's say 92A06. I think actually I have that here, where the first digit of 9 is Bulova. The second digit is the color. So I think 1 was silver tone, stainless steel. 2 might have been gold tone. The third digit was the representative of the functionality, like a 3-handed watch was an A, a calendar watch was a B, C was a date, D was a diamond dial. So I was responsible for IT, so that was also something we had to accommodate with all our systems to be able to keep track, because used to check it that it was only a number, and now we didn't have enough numbers, we had to make modifications, and ultimately
I've been curious about that forever.
That's fantastic.
yeah. So I have this sort of attribute roadmap of what each one of those designations is. The Caravelle was a 4 to begin with. Digital began with an 8, those kinds of things. So
Wow, that's so. While we're talking about, all this information that you've had and created in that, how much of this, and it seems like a lot still, and a lot of collectors are under the impression that a lot of information on the brand has been lost over changing hands throughout the years, but how much of this still actually exists?
well, it's hard to say what you don't know. So
You're supposed to know, man. You're the expert.
I know what I know. I don't always know what I don't know.
Okay, so let me rephrase. How much of this stuff do you currently have in your archives?
Okay. In the archive, we have over 5,000 digital items, and we have about 2,600 physical items. So when you talk about digitization, we have to prioritize because we can't just digitize everything.
Mhm.
So sometimes, particularly, let's say in the 80s, I just have digitized the cover and maybe the back of a catalog, and I record where it is. We've created a metadata database so that I have a record of everything that I have, but I don't always have the internal pages for each one of those. I have a lot of instruction booklets, for instance, but I haven't necessarily digitized every single page within it. So I still have a lot of stuff. Mybulova.com has been great. Over the years, Watchophilia has been a great source. There are collectors that are out there. The guy that wrote a complete guide to Bulova Accutron watches, Daryl Hansen.
Mhm.
He wrote a 500-page book, and be on the lookout this summer. I think he's writing the sequel because it wasn't
Oh, wow.
complete guide to Bulova Accutron watches. And a wealth of information. There's a book on Bulova Art Deco watches from 1922 to 1930. It's have you seen that book?
I've heard about it. I haven't seen it.
It's digitized. I mean, it's a digital book, so that if you click on a style, you can bring up all of the ads that it appeared in.
Wow, really? That's
Edmondo,
fantastic.
Edmondo Clubhouse did a tremendous amount of research, looked at every ad, every magazine that these things were in, and it was a labor of love. And he has since written a sequel, the Bulova Art Deco Ladies Watches from 1931 to 1934. So
Fantastic.
these people have been great resources for collectors as well as for myself. So it's not just what I have, it's what everybody has. And sometimes I will point people to where other things, have all that detail, because I just can't do it.
So the digital copies of the line books that Joe and I have, are you responsible for that, or was that done?
I have them, I scanned them, but I know that there were other copies that were out there, and I think that maybe mybulova.com had some of them. But if he was missing something or I was missing something, we would share. So if you're missing anything, just drop me a line, let me know.
Reach out.
There you go.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So moving on, Bulova came into business with Citizen in the 1960s, which we've talked about. And they licensed the tuning fork movement. So then Citizen starts producing that in Japan, build their whole production facility. What was the reciprocation for that? What did Citizen gain from Bulova other than access to that technology? Was that about it?
Well, there was some strategic relationships. I say they marketed in the Japanese market and some other markets where they participated. That was going back to 1960s. I don't know what else they got out of it. Over the 100 years, Citizen has quite a bit of technology. So when you're starting to share technology and sharing, you can sort of learn from what other people have done. So, their knowledge base and exposure to some of the technologies that were state of the art at the time, I'm sure benefited them in their product development in other areas.
Okay. So let's talk about the Caravel Citizen relationship, because like Caravel was brought on as I don't think that we could call it specifically a Timex fighter, but that's what it sort of developed into. However, a lot of the early Caravel watches that I've collected have Swiss movements. And then there was a transition to the Miyota movements. And so what was that? What was that development like? How did we get to that specifically?
Well, first of all, I'd say Caravel was, I call it a diffusion brand. So it was sort of an entry level at those price points and sort of the quality that you could build in, especially on the movement side, were below what we would want to put Bulova on the dial and claim it would be a Bulova. It would be cannibalizing, price points, and we wanted to keep it separate. But we understood that we had a distribution network of 15,000, say, jewelers throughout the United States, plus department stores and such. So we had this distribution, and it now incrementally added a whole level of price point that we could get using our existing distribution. So I think that was really the impetus for doing it. And later on, actually, talk about collections. In late 1960s and early 70s, Bulova had a relationship with Christian Dior. You guys?
Yes.
So that also was very similar in that Christian Dior brought this fashion look and design that Bulova did not have. And Bulova brought the timekeeping technology that a company like a Christian Dior wouldn't be able to develop on their own. So they came
Well, it's
out.
always fascinating, specifically because those watches were very avant-garde for the time, asymmetric, lots of plastics, lots of thermo produced. It's very interesting collections, and I think that they're really forward thinking for the time specifically.
Yes, but there were also 14 karat gold watches also that were
Yes.
But yes, there were some very avant-garde looks and very edgy advertising also. and it was really, the reason I mention it now is we're talking about leveraging Bulova's distribution that Christian Dior didn't have. People would not buy a Christian Dior watch in a Christian Dior boutique or in a department store. You buy a watch in a jeweler. And we
Right.
had that distribution. So we could bring that to the party as well as the technology and how to make those watches. They brought the name and they brought the fashion design.
The distribution thing, I think, is something that, particularly in today's world where we're talking about, at will distribution, second day drop shipping direct from the manufacturer, that it's something that people don't really consider as much anymore, particularly from a supply chain aesthetic, that the fact that you needed to have in stock, it had to be at a warehouse, and it wasn't, you couldn't get it 2 days from Shenzhen, China. You needed to get it from a warehouse in San Bernardino in order for it to show up and in order to make it work. So it's such a different way that business works today versus how it worked 40 years ago.
Yeah, totally. And, we used to say, at one time the sales force reported to me, what you want to try to tell the associates in the stores is make sure that person puts a watch on their wrist. You've got to see it. You've got to feel it. But the game's changed now. And
it's only changed a little bit.
It hasn't. It hasn't.
Mike and I talk about this all the time, that there are watches that he has got that I'm like, and then I see it. And I'm like, okay, because as soon as you get it on, it changes the whole aesthetic. What is your wrist symmetry? Where are your bones protruding? What is the size of it? Oh, 42 is too big. Well, it depends on the watch. 36 is too small. Depends on the watch. All of those things, like, until you have it physically in hand, it's such a big deal, particularly with watches.
Yeah.
Can I bring it back to Caravel real quick?
Sure.
Towards the beginning of this conversation here. It has been discussed extensively between Joe and I and some other collectors that Caravel being the drugstore brand. Now, Bulova at the time, the 60s and 70s and so on, had a lot of conservative design. Not to say that that's a bad thing, because there were a lot of great designs, but they didn't have a lot of wild, bright colors. When you look at the number of SKUs that they offered at any one given time, the number of wild, colorful designs was fairly low. When you look at Caravel from the same era, while they did have conservative designs, it seems like they're more of the playground for design. Was Caravel used as kind of, let's throw this idea at the wall, see what sticks, put it in the marketplace, and then if it works, we can kind of transition that into Bulova?
Yeah.
Is that kind of their purpose, or am I looking at it completely different?
No, but well, first of all, you said drugstore brand, but it was more Timex was the drugstore brand, and Bulova was more the retail.
Well, in referencing Caravel being the drugstore brand, not Bulova.
Well, but it was really sold through the same distribution channels. That it elevated the image of Caravel by being sold through jewelers. But
Okay.
I do agree with you that there were even some very funky pendants.
Yes.
In Caravel, I think for those price points, it could be I wouldn't say necessarily disposable, but it could be an impulse buy that you buy because you like it, but it may not be something that you wear 3 years from now.
Yes.
So
not exactly a fashion brand, but close.
Right, but you can take risks by buying that because it's fun and I'm going to wear it and I'm going to like it and people are going to like it. But you're not necessarily tied to it. It's not as much of an investment as at the time maybe a Bulova would have been.
Right. And that's funny because some of the Caravel models of that time far exceeded what the Bulova counterpart was. Their design and the build quality and the movements were equal to or greater than some of the Bulova models being offered.
It's such an interesting time period, and looking at what it is from a design, like it's interesting to look at some of the Bulova designs, particularly if we're talking about the Jetstar line, because a lot of the Jetstar, particularly like the watch you showed, the Jetstar D, which is very close to an Omega. and there's a level of derivative that comes in some of the Bulova lines, but it seems at Caravel there was a whole lot more of exploration, innovation, and it could be it really, let's throw it against the wall and see what sticks. The color palette, lots of browns, lots of reds, lots of oranges, just colors that you don't see outside of the 70s, but you really don't see within the Bulova line either. And so, like, Mike and I have always considered that Caravel was where the designers got to play.
Yeah, it was a fun brand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike, have you ever seen the Spinnaker?
It's funny you mentioned that. I have. I owned one. My collecting style is very, let's say 70 to 75, very funky, very colorful, crazy designs. That's where I'm at. The Spinnaker definitely fills that spot.
It's
However,
every niche in that. However, he didn't have it on the strap, and it ruins the whole aesthetic.
The Spinnaker, for whatever reason, just did not catch my eye in a way that some other watches did, and I traded it away for the vintage Super Seville Day-Date that I have now, which I'm way more impressed
Well,
with.
one thing for the people out there, the Spinnaker has a stripe that's off center in a particular color. It might be green or orange, but one thing that's very cool is the packaging for that. The stripe is also asymmetric throughout the
on the packaging, yeah.
On the packaging, it goes through the strap, and that's the hardest part, because those straps, if you didn't take care of it, you didn't manage it, it did not hold up throughout the years. And so, like, you can find the watch head all the time, but trying to find one on the original strap, or finding anybody who's got a strap that will work, because you've got 3 iterations of it. You've got the red and or the orange and white, the white and green, and then the orange and black. And man, just like if you don't find that sucker on the strap, and then there's 2 different dial iterations too, more like a radial dial. They're cool watches. Don't get me wrong.
That's a good example of watches that show up in the line books and watches that don't. So what market was that Spinnaker meant for? Was it meant for the US market? Because it never shows up in the books.
It's hard to tell. It would be conjecture on my part, but it was a fun thing. It pops in the showcase.
They're striking watches. They're visually striking, and you notice.
Yeah. By the way, there are quite a few things I know that don't show up in the line books. A lot of times, by the way, 14-karat gold watches don't show up there because they were often not produced in high volume.
There are the platinum astronauts, and there's not a lot of those, and they don't show up in the line books either.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, what I sometimes do is I'll go through the annual reports, I'll go through the advertisements to try to identify a watch that may not be in the line book.
Okay, Carl, I'm bringing you a bottle of scotch. We need to hang out. I want that. I want to do that. Don't show me the stuff that's in the display cases. Show me the books. Man, that's awesome. God. Wow, man, that's awesome.
One more question before I got to duck out here. And this is one I think that's a little further down on the question list, but I wanted to bring it up because this is something that I actually wanted to know about. And Joe had mentioned that offline he had discussed this with you, but the topic of serial numbers with the prefixes, and the original answer was you really didn't have any information on it. Were you able to uncover anything, or is that still a mystery?
Country codes.
It's still a mystery as far as country codes. When I was there, I know that we had certain designations for vendors and vendor codes embedded within the case reference. So we would know this particular manufacturer made this case. We even had situations where a particular style was multiple sourced, so that just because it was style, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, didn't mean that the case came from this manufacturer. It may have evolved over the years for somebody else to make it. So we put a vendor code. But as far as country codes and like 6- or whatever, I don't know anything more than is out there on the blogs and the mybulova.coms and the other things. I did try to look that up. Sometimes even, let's say, Italy, they would go off and do some things on their own. It was more of a self-contained, um, uh, somewhat rogue sometimes at times, and would go off and do things. And if it wasn't going to hit the U.S. market, I don't think Bulova cared as much.
Were those being produced in the Swiss factories, and it was just a sub-Italian order? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I mean, you'd ask me even on the Kyrelli, the Marine Star, that was done totally in Europe to begin with. So I mean, we had a plant in Bienne, Switzerland,
right?
But there are other assemblers that are out there in the Jura area of Switzerland, and Italy is very strong, and even in Ticino in Switzerland, you've got a lot that supplies the Italian market, but it's Swiss.
Well, I'm thinking specifically about some of the Lemania movement chronographs that were, late 70s, early 80s. I was looking at one today, and it's a 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock chrono register. And it's that standard sort of Lemania movement that was really popular throughout the late 70s, early 80s. But it never reached the U.S. domestic market at all. And I find these on, Chrono 24 or on some of the European eBay sites. And it's an intriguing watch because you just don't see anything like that. And Lemania movements are not ones that really made it to the U.S. domestically. But Bulova, at least European Bulova, particularly Italian Bulova, had a relationship with them. And so that's always a fascinating discussion because you look at it's like, okay, here is this weird something. And it's obviously it's legit. The case back is right. All of the signatures are correct. But it's not in any line book. It's not a U.S. domestic, like no clue about where it came from.
No, but even when I was responsible for Italy, we had product that was out there. There were even catalogs or brochures that, I didn't realize I was going to be a historian later on. So I didn't keep a lot of this stuff, but it's gone. But you'll even see casebacks, like the use of the Goddess of Time.
Yes.
It's a little bit stylized. How it's represented on the case back, different in Europe than it was in the United States. So, I'm sometimes in touch with still the old sales reps from the Italian market, and sometimes
no kidding.
I'll send them. I'll do a Google translate and send them a question and say, "Do you remember this style from like the '90s or whatever?" And I'll try to leverage the relationships to see if I can get some answers.
Well, Carl, I'm extremely sad that I have to leave. This has been very insightful so far with just the information that you've given us up until this point. A lot of answers that Joe and I have been, looking for quite some time. This is it's going to have to be a two-part episode. So we're actually going to end part one here now. And then Joe, you and Carl can pick up part two. I will not be here for that episode. And very rarely do I listen to my own podcast, but I will have to tune in to that one myself just to hear the rest of the information and knowledge that you have to dispense for everybody. So it's truly been an honor to sit here and talk with you and pick your brain. An absolute pleasure. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I'm sure I speak for Joe for coming on and spending some good quality time with us. And I'm sure, we have a lot of listeners that are very technical into history and details and things like that. And I'm sure they're loving, part one as we're sitting here and part two coming up. So again, for me, thank you for coming on. I absolutely appreciate it. And hopefully this is not the last time that we talk.
Very true. Very true.
Maybe we can kind of go off in some of these tangents a little more explicitly here. So,
yep. And so I hope it's been informative. It's been actually a lot of fun. Great to meet you guys. And it's great to hear about people's passion about the brand. And, I learn as much as you guys learn.
But wait, there's more. So, Carl,
There's more.
if people want to get in touch with you or they want to be able to reach out to Bulova for information to the archives, how can they get in touch with you specifically?
I don't want to give out my personal email
There,
here.
don't do that.
But I think we had set up a historian at bulova.com, bulovawatchgroup.com, but I don't know if that's actually still live. But people sort of
Find out.
People find me through customer service, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. What I don't like to do is people say, "How much is this watch worth?" Well, that's not
Yeah,
That's
that's
not
very
you.
subjective.
But as far as I'm also open to having people donate things to the archive.
That's
People
me.
wanna preserve the legacy. I had a salesman that worked for me many, many years ago, and when he was 83, he wrote to me and said his wife had passed away, and would I accept his wife's accutrons for the archives. And it turns out
Yes.
it was an accutron that I happened to be looking for because I had an ad for it. And I actually displayed it at one of the last Basel Worlds.
That's fantastic.
So I wrote to him back and I sent him a picture and I said, your wife's legacy, continues on.
That's wonderful.
That's fantastic.
That's everything about that is so fantastic.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to stop you there.
All
right, great.
This is the end of part 1. I won't wait. Make you guys wait for part 2. We'll do it either within a couple days of this one or the next week from when you're listening to this. So until next time, cheers.
Bye, Mike.
Cheers.